Okay, hello, my name is Diane Lalonde. I am a research and knowledge mobilization specialist with the Learning Network. And on behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub, welcome to our webinar, Partnering with Media for Change, Disrupting Harmful Narratives on Gender-Based Violence. I want to start by acknowledging that our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Changa'an nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra treaties as 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We make this acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous land and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settled colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence on oppressed communities. I'm happy today to be joined by our panelists, Shari Graydon, Yasmin Jiwani, and Jennifer Richardson. Shari is the CEO of Informed Opinions. Dr. Yasmin Jiwani is a full professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia University in Montreal. And Jennifer Richardson is the Senior Director of Strategy and Communications at the Ontario Native Women's Association. We are going to share a link to their full bios in the chat, but we are going to move forward into our conversation at this point. So I'd like to invite the panelists to please turn on your video and audio. Wonderful, thank you. And so I know I gave a short introduction, and this first question will give you a bit more space to speak to your work as it pertains to this webinar topic. We're wondering if you can share from your experience and your perspective, how is gender-based violence represented in Canadian media? What is going well and what challenges remain? And Jennifer, I'd like to turn to you first, please.
Thank you, Diane. Thanks for inviting me to have this, I think, important conversation today. I reside in the Niagara region, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people, and is also protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, but is also covered by the Upper Canada's Treaty. I am glad to reside and work with Indigenous people all across Canada. Just very quickly, I'll mention this just because having done a lot of media, probably some folks know, probably some do not. But I was sex trafficked as a child for a number of years. And so a lot of my work in gender-based violence has really focused on human trafficking, sex trafficking, MMIWG issues for folks who are being trafficked or have been trafficked and then murdered and are still missing. And so a lot of, I think, the work that I've done has really centered around that and come from both a professional experience of having done the work that I've done for most of my career, but also a personal lens. So I wanted to add that because I think some of the things that I might add will lay reference to that. And also, ONWA does have the largest anti-human trafficking Indigenous-led programming in Canada. So I think, again, just to quickly kind of context that for folks. Back to your question. I think from my perspective, and definitely from, I think, many folks at ONWA's perspective, we typically still are seeing Indigenous women not represented as greatly as other groups of women in media. So less coverage to some of the things that are occurring for them that are gender-based in violence. And when you do see some of the coverage, it's often in or framed or context in a negative tone. And so, just an example, I think of that is that I've, again, seen a lot, and I know colleagues at ONWA have seen a lot all over Ontario, is when we're talking about, young folks who have been trafficked or sexually exploited through that way in which people are targeting young Indigenous women. often the tone is a very high-risk lifestyle. They're leading a high-risk lifestyle. We don't talk about it in that way, though, when you're seeing arrests or people who have been captured in online abuse images or videos. You don't often hear the high-risk lifestyle, and really a lifestyle of being abused isn't really a lifestyle, right? Then that really centers kind of the blame on the victim. And so I tend again to see a lot of that in media, and that I think really shapes general public's kind of view on who really is a victim and who isn't, subconsciously, because of the way it's positioned. And so I think we're definitely still seeing a lot of that, which we would like to definitely see change. I think the other thing we often see at Onwa is really the erasure or the like voidness of Indigenous women's experiences with systemic racism and how that has impacted some of the situations that occur to them. And again, not because of them, right? But we don't often see a lot of that couched in all these systemic or isms that happen for Indigenous women. We just kind of see, again, lots of narrative around what they did or didn't do. And I know we see that in other areas of gender-based violence too, but definitely we still see kind of that framing, which again, I think isn't really helpful to general public, right? Then they don't necessarily see all of the barriers that Indigenous women face that are different for Indigenous women than non-Indigenous women. And that, again, can just be highlighted with MMIWG, right? Indigenous women's organizations across Canada, for as long as I can remember, have talked about Indigenous women being murdered and going missing at this rapid, number, and the response not being as good as other groups of people see when they're reporting their loved ones missing, them not being taken as serious. And so again, I think the work that Indigenous women have done to bring that to the forefront, to have an inquiry, and for media to even actually be covering some of those stories, because prior they were not, really needs to go, the credit to Indigenous women leaders across Canada and in the US, I would say, for really, bringing that to the forefront for other groups to really recognize that a lot of these issues are happening because of the systemic failures of our system. And with media, sometimes in media I've often wondered if it's unconscious bias on the reporter's part as well. Not knowing what they don't know and reporting things in a way, again, that isn't helpful to families or to victims. So I think that's something that, again, we would at Onwa definitely like to see change. I think it was a big question you asked, but I'm gonna try to section it or bucket it a bit. I think we also kind of need to see media addressing some of those dynamics of colonization more, because again, we're just not seeing media talk about the violence, racism, sexism, patriarchalism, colonialism that has created the situations by which we now are seeing, and probably have forever seen, but now we at least have some data that rates of sexual violence for Indigenous women are 3 times higher than other groups of women. They're 3 times more likely to have spousal violence perpetrated against them. They're 7 times more likely to be murdered than non-Indigenous women. And I think am somewhat in awe that as Canadians, people have not been horribly ashamed by that. It's an awful thing. I know people love to fly their Canadian flag when they go to different countries, but when you're talking to general public and not necessarily people in the field that work with folks and understand some of the issues that, you know, gender-based violence is creating for Indigenous people or other minority folks through those systemic issues. But it is, you know, it's a shameful thing, I think, on our country and on our citizens that we don't see more outrage, more concern from general public around the numbers of, you know, missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. And it's still happening. You know, we recently really tried to amplify some of the Indigenous women's organizations that were in Winnipeg, talking about the serial murders that had happened there. And that's not the first serial murder that's happened in Winnipeg. It's also not the first person who has, you know, murdered Indigenous women and left them in a dump. And again, why there is not more outrage in that situation is still, I think, hurtful, right? For families, for sure, for victims, for loved ones. And I think it should be hurtful to all of us, because that's the truth now, and we know it. You know, there's been lots of evidence now, you know, pointing to the staggering numbers that I just talked about for Indigenous women. I think another challenge that, you know, again, I've seen throughout my career, and I know, again, colleagues have seen, is the adultifying of young Indigenous women, and how, again, once that happens or is perpetrated by the media, that then, again, people tend to think, well, you're an adult, you make your own decisions, you know, you decided to be in this situation, versus children. And so we see younger Indigenous women being adultified at, again, higher rates than we see non-Indigenous folks being, you know, adultified by media. And that's something, again, too, that I think just reinforces those stereotypes that, you know, UNWA has fought for a long time, and other Indigenous women's organizations across Canada have really pushed back on media for a very, very, very long time. Some of my colleagues right now are at the Women Deliver conference in Rwanda, which is, you know, the largest equity conference in the world, women's conference in the world. And we had been reading just recently that the UN Economic and Social Affairs report talked about it taking us 286 years in the world to achieve equality for women. And again, you know, to close those gaps on legal protections for women, and especially minority women or Indigenous women, is probably even longer. And we need to be concerned about that, right? The media needs to be used, I think, to help folks who are not necessarily working in the sector understand that it is a serious issue. I know Shari introduced herself, you know, she said, we're half the population, and, you know, we deserve to be heard. And I would 100% agree with that. And so I think, you know, we really do need the media to help educate and inform general public on some of the issues that we're facing and Indigenous women are facing in Canada. Do you want me to keep talking, or do you want to let other folks chime in, and maybe you can come back to me? This is a big question.
It is. I'll do that, Jennifer. I'll
Okay.
come back to you. But thank you so much for identifying that and starting us off so well in terms of the things that you're seeing, and also how media perceptions then impact societal perceptions and the relationship between that. And I think that leads very well into your work, Yasmin. I wonder if you want to answer next.
Sure. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Algonquin territory, and as an immigrant, refugee, settler, I'm very appreciative of the fact that I can be here and that I can occupy this space. So I'll start with that. And I want to sort of follow up kind of on what Jennifer was saying, because it's so much of what that rich experience, I mean, that firsthand experience shows, is exactly what I want to get into, which are what are the patterns. So if I were to take an intersectional perspective, so much of it depends on where you're located in the rungs of the ladder that has been established by white supremacy and colonization. If you are an Indigenous woman, you are likely to be located at the bottom of that. So your worthiness as a victim is very much dependent on that. If you're a woman of color who comes from a different tradition, your experiences are likely to be confined to that space in that ladder. And it comes back to the fact that if we were thinking about equity, which group of women actually benefited the most? And it's been white women. So I think we need to always think about this intersectionally. Which victims are considered worthy, which victims are blamed, and which perpetrators are exonerated in the whole process. So if I were to look at this from a sort of broad global perspective, one of the things that becomes very clear, sorry, my throat, is the fact that so much of the violence, the reporting on violence against women sort of is glued to common narratives. And many of these narratives have to do with passionate crime. So, he was passionately in love with her. He felt like if he couldn't have her, nobody could have her. And there is this sort of ownership about a woman's body. And I think we have to bear that in mind, because when we look at the fact of what happens across cultures, this is the same perspective, but oftentimes it's not seen the same way. It's actually labeled as honor killing. So, it's tied to a tradition. So it's like saying, well, so-and-so is Muslim, and therefore, the victim believed, or the perpetrators believed in this honor tradition, and that's why they did it, without looking at the commonality, that it's the fact that in either case, a woman's body is being used. So this passionate love stuff has been going on for quite a while. And if you look at especially the Italian reportage, it's very much present over there in terms, and you look at the Turkish one, it's very much present there. In Canada, it tends to sort of like focus in on passionate love gone wrong, in the sense that the perpetrator is always considered to be somebody who is mentally challenged, who has had different life struggles, who is now sort of at the end of his rope and therefore has committed this crime. So the crime itself is psychologized in that way, but only for a particular group of men. So white men, it's psychologized in that way. For Black men, it's considered to be a part of a cultural trait. For South Asian men, it's considered, again, a cultural issue. So everything sort of gets partitioned off in that way. And this is why the colonial framework and the post-colonial framework is so important for us to embrace when we think about violence. What kind of violence? The second thing is that in the patterns that are there, the mainstream media tend to focus on what I call episodic instances. So one of a kind, rather than putting it into a pattern. So rather than seeing something as systemic, they will look at it as an episode. So for instance, if I were to go back to the Indigenous the research that I've done, there was in fact a case of a white man, who constantly sort of like made sure that the Indigenous women he was with would drink as much as possible and then take advantage of them. He was known as the drunken perpetrator, or the person who engaged in that. Now, this is only one instance, and it's presented as one instance, rather than putting it into the whole pattern of exactly what's going on since colonization in terms of Indigenous women. So how, in fact, have Indigenous women been disempowered or rendered into, culpable victims? And it's the culpability that comes in, which is something that Jennifer pointed out. How, in fact, this idea that these women are living a high-risk life and therefore are responsible for what happens to them as fallen women, right? So that's the other thing that comes in. And then the third thing that happens is the fact is, are they worthy victims? So if you have a construction or a portrayal of women as being culpable, responsible for their own fate, then clearly they're not worthy victims. Where they become worthy victims is if they cross the color line. So the more white they become, the more worthy they become. And you see this, in fact, I've seen this in the coverage that I analyzed of the Shafia girls that were murdered by their father and brother. And how, in fact, when those girls were sort of portrayed in terms of being just like us, they wanted to have a life like us, which is basically like a white person. Then, sorry. Then, in fact, what happens is that they become worthy, they become salvageable. So it's the idea of which women can be saved, right? And which women can be saved and salvaged, and which women are considered to be disposable and dispensable. So that's the other sort of narrative that's there. And finally, sort of touching in on the idea of elaborating on the victim blaming. There is a sort of commodification or naturalizing of women's deaths in the racialized category. And this is particularly true in terms of Indigenous women, Black women, South Asian women, so any women that are considered to be not white. And you can see this even in terms of the coverage that's there with poor women or women who are sex workers. They are those women that are considered to be fallen. So in those cases, you know, there is a naturalization, and this naturalization happens in terms of this high risk lifestyle. It happens in terms of where they were living. So for instance, there's one case where, you know, the small report that came in a newspaper when I was tracking femicides was this woman was killed because she was living in a high-rise apartment alone. Now, if you were to substitute a man in there, we would never have that kind of explanation. So the framing that's there in terms of this culpability, in terms of which groups of women become defined in which way, is very much sort of resonant with narratives about, you know, which women live alone. And well, if they live alone, it's their fault. They didn't find a partner. They didn't find a family that looked after them. So with Indigenous women, if you're itinerant, if you're moving from place to place, you have no address. So if you have no address, you don't really have a life. That's considered grievable. So these are sort of some of the other ways in which the media do this. And finally, the sexist and racist undertones that are there in all of these stories and that lace the stories provide us with a framework where we almost sort of think, well, of course, you know, if she's living on by herself on some high rise in an area that is already racialized because it's low income, that's her fault. So those class, race, religion, like in terms of Islam, all of these things come through in the way in which a report is structured. And part of that has to do with the fact that the media use templates and frames. So a template becomes a very, it's a shorthand way of making sense of an event, right? So for instance, the stories that we hear right now about the landfill and Indigenous women's bodies being found in the landfill is very much sort of like fitted into this frame. Well, you know, how did they end up in a landfill? Clearly they were, you know, leading high-risk lives and they ended up there. Those frames have been there for a long time. And so it's really critical in terms of how we as anti-violence workers and advocates and activists actually challenge those frames. How do we begin to do that? So I'll leave it to that because I think that's part of your second question.
Yes, thank you. And so many resonances between yourself and Jennifer, to the assigning of fault that we see. And we did share your reading, Yasmin, on the hierarchies of worthiness, which I think you spoke to very well. So if folks are interested, please refer to that reading as well. Shari, I want to give you the opportunity too to speak a bit more about how women generally are excluded from media And also how when women try to step into media, they might experience forms of violence like technology facilitated violence.
Okay, thank you so much. I am coming to you from Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, where I am blessed to live and work and play. I want to go back a little bit historically, because the part of my frame for this work that we do at Informed Opinions was informed by research done in the 1990s when Informed Opinions was Media Watch. We were doing an annual newspaper study counting up laboriously how often women versus men were quoted in daily papers across the country. And we ended up, when we looked at the data at the end of the study, we had picked one day and looked at 15 papers. And it was the fourth year of a study, and there was a sudden increase, only 3%, but we thought, okay, this is significant, we're making gains. And what we discovered was the reason women were more quoted in 1992 than previous years was because the date we had picked coincided with the day after Paul Bernardo had been arrested. And so the 3% increase in references to women came about as a result of the references to his two identified victims, Leslie French and Kristen Mahaffey. We were going to call the report "Women Dying to Get into the Headlines." And then, as I say, we abandoned the research because it was so discouraging. But a few years later, there was a global media monitoring project study that looked at women's presence in the news of the world. And it determined that women were more likely to make the news as a victim of violence than in any other capacity. I think that may have changed in the last 20 or so years. But what we are still seeing is that women's voices and presence is chronically, systemically underrepresented. We're being quoted about 30% of the time. Our gender gap tracker, I'll send the link in a minute, I forgot to share that, allows us to measure in real time the ratio of men and women being quoted in Canada's most influential media. And we have a French version called Adultification, which does it in French. So the underrepresentation of women in the media in other aspects and chronically in all aspects, and then the overemphasis on violence. And it's not that we don't want news media to report on violence against women, of course we do, but one of the challenges is that because there's an overemphasis of women as victims, and there isn't the counter content that portrays and reinforces our agency and our capacity in every other realm, that also contributes to many of the trends that Jennifer and Yasmin have already spoken about. I will say a couple of other things. You know, news by definition centers around power. Who has it, who threatens it, but also it needs to and should more frequently address who is disempowered by these structures in place. And I think that's one of the things that as advocates, we can reinforce with journalists, that their job is not only to afflict the comfortable, but comfort the afflicted. And so the over-reliance on official sources, which is something else our research has determined, our gender gap tracker, when we did a deeper dive into the data, what we determined was that 60% of the most quoted men and women in the news media in Canada are elected officials. And what that means is that we're only hearing 40% of the time from those who are not with their hands on the levers of power. And that's an imbalance that I think also we could request be corrected. One of the other significant things that we've found in our work at Informed Opinions is we train women with informed opinions across disciplines and sectors to become more effective and comfortable in engaging with media. And we've been training them to write op-eds or written commentaries for 14 years now. In 2016, we took 100 of those op-eds and we put them into a word cloud, and we compared the issues that came up against issues that came up in word clouds written only by men. And when we deducted the common words, and if it's possible to share the word cloud, what we discovered was that all sorts of issues specifically related to women and violence were coming up. And what the word cloud told us was that without women's voices, if women are not actively seeking to write commentary, saying yes to media interviews, the issues that affect us so much more and differently than men are not being attended to. So that's a big reason that we exist, to help counter that, to ensure that people understand. And I should just say, now that you can see the word cloud, we did this word cloud before Bill Cosby, before the Me Too movement. And even then, women writing op-eds were overemphasizing evidence, child sexual, female violence, representation, all of those things. So I think that's an indicator of the challenges that we face, the necessity of women's voices being present. And I hope to share in the rest of my comments some specific strategies to support people on the call in becoming more effective at that. And part of that, I will also just flag, is that as you mentioned in introducing me, women are disproportionately affected by being targeted on social media and being the subject of tech facilitated violence, and especially women with intersectional identities. So Black women, brown women, Indigenous women, immigrant women, Muslim women, LGBTQ, we know that they are being egregiously assaulted on social media every day. And that obviously has a huge impact on their ability, their willingness to engage, to stay present, to have a voice, because social media plays such a significant role now in facilitating or indeed silencing that. So our Toxic Hush initiative is aimed at drawing attention to that discrepancy and discrimination and abuse online, to politicians, to have them act, and acknowledging that women and those with intersectional identities are even more egregiously targeted.
Thank you, Shari. And I might just stay with you for a moment in terms of our next question, which is, what does engagement with the media look like given your work? So for instance, a lot of people who are attending or in the anti-violence sector, what can they expect when media approaches them?
Yeah, so, we have lots of resources. I'll preface my comments with saying we have lots of resources online, and I know you're going to share the handout that we created specifically. But I think having some basic understanding of journalist context is really helpful. So, remembering that the journalist is on deadline, they are operating in a news environment that privileges power, because that's what fundamentally news is new, and it's about people with power. And understanding that conflict and controversy are part of the frame, and that being on deadline means they have to work fast, and they are working with fewer resources and fewer colleagues today than they ever were before. And so none of that excuses the kind of bad behavior or egregious discriminatory framing that Yasmin and Jennifer have talked about, but it is useful as a frame, as a context for understanding how they report. And one of the things I would say further to the word cloud is that if and when you get called, appreciating that you all have many other duties to attend to, if you can respond right away, even if it's to say, I'm not available, but here's a resource that would be useful. But if you can say yes, because you have deep, intimate knowledge of the realities and the nuances and the complexities, your voices are really critical at shaping how media end up framing. As a columnist many years ago in Vancouver, writing about the Robert Pickton case, I benefited enormously from women in the sector who were able to give me context and analysis. And the other thing I'll say, maybe just top line, is to encourage you to appeal explicitly to the humanity of the journalists that you're dealing with. Most journalists become journalists because they want to make the world a better place. They want to afflict the comfortable. And although they may end up defaulting by practice into, focusing on electoral politics and not going into the community and telling stories in a really responsible way, reminding them, I know you want to get this right. I know you don't want to re-victimize the people who are being harmed here. And so let me suggest some ways that you can do that. Treat journalists like human beings, be authentic and real with them, and they're more likely to respond in kind.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And I know, Jennifer, you mentioned you've done a lot of media interviews. I know I've seen you on media interviews, so it's so lovely to have this conversation. I wonder if you want to speak even from a more personal experience in terms of what it looks like when media reaches out to you.
Yeah, I can probably do both. My role in my employment, and just having been in media for quite some time. I'll start quick personally. I don't think, when I was public, there were, I probably could count about 5 women across the country that were publicly speaking to media or speaking about them having been exploited through sex trafficking. And I think oftentimes reporters, would want all of the gritty, awful details. And I'm, again, having dealt with a lot of media outlets, both in my employment and personally, definitely it's, because that is what sells, which is unfortunate, right? It's unfortunate that in our society, people want to hear all of the awful things that have happened to folks by media. I usually would not go down that rabbit hole, one, because, and I am very conscious even in speaking to people that, I don't want to traumatize them. So I don't want to tell people details or nitty-gritty details, because for some people, and again, probably not most people on this webinar, but having worked in the field, they know that the details can be pretty awful. And so I think, again, that's something that we, need to change in the media, is not always looking for these really awful details, but, who was that person, and who do who are they? What is their family? What does the community think of them? Like, again, so a bit of the shifting of the narrative of not, here's all the awful things that have happened to me, or the awful things that have happened to someone. Here's who they were. So I think a bit to Shari's point of humanizing also the people, and talking to reporters, are appealing to that aspect for sure. And it's a bit of a tough challenge. I mean, to Yasmin's point around her research and the runging, or the slating of people depending on their privilege, which again, Indigenous, Brown, and other racialized folks, LGBTQ plus folks, don't have that automatic privilege that I would. I'm white, blonde, blue-eyed, so I definitely have that privilege, but that dehumanizing happens very young. I mean, as Indigenous women have been sexualized by settlers, colonizers since the beginning of time in this country, and in lots of forms of media, not just media that we kind of, when I hear media, I think of the news, but also in kids shows. I mean, Pocahontas is a great example of that, right? It's this fairy tale love story. Well, no, it isn't. She was kidnapped and being sexually abused by an adult male, right? And people are showing this to their kids. And so I think, again, that reality for different groups of folks isn't, often shared, and or we have, a society that has this really skewed view of it. And so really drawing awareness to the reality, I think, is really important, or something that I absolutely try to do in my role, both as on-West communication senior director, but also I think in my role as a trafficked, exploited person who speaks a lot for other folks that might not feel they have their voice yet. And one of the things that I've really talked about is not just labeling people as a sex traffic victim, or, you know, a spousal domestic violence, you know, murder victim, or those labels, again, because for some people, that label stays with them for a long time, that label is very difficult to move from that place. So seeing the strength in people is also really important. Again, I know I'm preaching to the choir on this webinar, but I do think it's important when you're talking to media to try and interweave that. We definitely at ONWA, you know, part of our entire mission is to celebrate and really honor Indigenous women. And we share lots of achievements and accomplishments in their leadership in Canada, because it's vast. But you don't often hear that. Again, and the media is not necessarily celebrating that. And I think, you know, again, to one of Shari's, you know, points, and to Yasmin's, there's not a lot of safe space for women of color in media in Canada, right? That, you know, CBC has turned off all their commenting on Indigenous news stories. Mary Simon had to shut down her, you know, comments. And even at ONWA, the larger our social media presence has grown, the more trolling we've found, and the more difficult it has been to, you know, continually be removing really negative, sexist, stereotypical, ill-informed comments from people that, again, are, you know, very, very ignorant to the actual realities and beauty of Indigenous women and all that they've contributed and continue to contribute to our communities and countries. So I think in saying all the bad things I've said, I do think there are some things that we've maybe seen that, again, that have you know, helped bring Indigenous women's voices to the forefront, and that's really been speaking in solidarity. ONWA is the largest and oldest Indigenous women's organization in Canada, and in really doing that work, ONWA has really focused on trying to, you know, bring other Indigenous women's organizations to the table and utilize the tools that we have as a fairly large organization now to, again, amplify messages from smaller communities or smaller organizations, and really recognize the power of that collective strength for folks. And I think that has had some small successes, for sure, not exactly where we would like to be, but some small steps in the right direction. I also think, as much as the social media can be used negatively by offenders and by folks who are harming Indigenous women and women in general, it also has allowed some of those communities to actually shape their own narrative, right? And I think that's important, because, again, I think for a lot of people, again, if you're working in the media and there's this timeline to get out and you need the story and you gotta, you know, move, sometimes that narrative isn't, you know, exactly the way in which you want it. I have found when I've reached back out to reporters to say, like, this was misrepresented, or this could be said better in this way, that from 95% of the time they change it, which is helpful. And I don't know if folks know that, but again, you can, you know, reach out and say, this didn't land how I wanted it to, or wasn't intended to. So I think, you know, that's another good little tip. I think the technology as well, you know, with everybody having a camera on their phone now and being able to record things like as they happen, has helped, again, I think, validate marginalized communities, you know, voice and what they've been saying that everyone has been ignoring for years, right? And saying, well, that didn't happen, or no, there's no crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, or no, you know, there's no mass graves. I mean, Indigenous people have been saying this for a very, very, very long time. This is not new. But I think some of the technology has allowed, again, Indigenous communities and women to have their own narrative and put that out there in the way in which it's happening for them, whether that's, you know, being attacked in public by someone verbally, or again, you know, just some of the ways in which camera phones are now kind of being able to capture real instant, like real-time events. I think has also been a bit helpful to communities and Indigenous women for sure. Do you want me to go on with how engagement? I was kind of going back and forth on that one, sorry.
No, it's so helpful. And I appreciate your tips. Like, I didn't know that you could reach back out to journalists.
Yeah, I've had
I
to do
might-
that a lot.
Yeah. I'd like to, I'm so interested as well to hear Yasmin's thoughts, and then we'll come back to you, Jennifer, in terms of everything we've been talking about, but also any like concrete strategies that you found worked in terms of collaborating with media.
So I'm going to sort of draw on both Jennifer and Shari's work in terms of like how, how do we change the story? I think this is the important thing. How do we change the story? And how do we counter the existing frames? Well, one of the things is knowing the lay of the land. So as Shari says, how are these reporters working? So when it comes to violence against women, most of the times the reports actually come from the police sources. So police stations will have, in fact, they're sort of like, they'll have their meetings where the media are present, and that's where they lay out, okay, this is what's happened, this is what's happened. Having an anti-violence worker there, right there at those police beats, or to have them at those sort of press hearings, is one way in which you can actually change that story. So it just doesn't become a story about, or another statistic about such and such body was found. It becomes a story about, well, so-and-so is a person whose body was found. So that's one thing that in fact has worked, and some groups have tried it, particularly in Australia, and it has actually made an impact. The second thing is to have, in fact, and I remember in the 90s, I don't know if they still do it anymore, but the Battered Women's Support Services actually had a meeting every month where they would have different sectors present at this meeting. So they would have the crown lawyers present, they would have the police there, they would have the city's mayor there. They would have a whole group, and what they would do is that they would actually fill out the information that had been provided. So they would say, this person who was killed, here's the story. So that's another way in which this really works. And the third way is the context, which is something that Shari and Jennifer both talked about, is how do we insert context? So it's not simply a matter of just naming, but let's put it in the context of the violence itself. So the violence hasn't just happened right then, because the focus is always on this last minute where you have a dead body. It predates that. And when we look at the fact that we have, in fact, with a lot of the frontline workers, the expertise where you have the circle of violence and seeing how, in fact, that escalation happened, this becomes really important information. So it shows, in fact, that this is a pattern. This has been going on for a long time. And it isn't something that just came up like that. So that's one other thing. And then I think the final thing is also sort of like to step in and change the framing of the story to say, well, this isn't really about culture. This is about femicide. And this is what happens across the board. So the more we bring in the stats, the better it is in terms of showing up the pattern, rather than focusing on a singular incident. So again, I want to go back to the fact that much of this work has to be done from an intersectional perspective. Listening to what Shari was saying about how the reportage went up after the Paul Bernardo case really brings up the point of what has been described, even in terms of critical journalism studies, about the sort of like the white damsel in distress narrative. So when it's a white child, when it's a white woman, young white woman, they become sort of focal points. And this is where there's an amazing amount of attention put in on those cases. Whereas all of the other cases that are happening in the background simply disappear. So again, we need to, I think, always have that kind of intersectional perspective, because otherwise we lose sight of things that are happening. And I remember this very clearly when I was writing about the Rena Verk case. and analyzing this case, which, got a lot of media attention. And she was a young South Asian 14-year-old who had been murdered. Why did it get that attention? When right across the country, just 60 miles from Montreal, a Cuban girl was clubbed to death in the same way. So she's not mentioned at all, but this one is. And why? Well, there was a whole reason. One, it was the idea of girl-on-girl violence as being the frame that was sort of like taking away skillfully and very strategically attention away from patriarchal violence. So that was one thing. And the second thing was the fact that she was South Asian, so this could be trapped within that whole cultural narrative, right? She comes from a very strict family. They wouldn't let her go out. So consequently, she left home, and look what happened to her. That wasn't the case on the other side of the country. So you can see, in fact, how the reporting changes. And the only way we can actually disrupt that is to have, in fact, the voices of activists and advocates present at all times. Now, this is not to say that, Shari was able to do this when she was doing the Picton case, but my analysis of the Picton case from all the reports that I read and analyzed was, in fact, you hardly saw the victim's perspective coming. You actually had the focus was on Picton himself. The focus was on, in fact, how he was sort of mentally challenged. The focus was on what family he came from. So it wasn't until there was a whole sort of like movement, and this is where social media comes in, a movement from the margins, a movement from the communities, with the aid of, in fact, people like the filmmakers at the National Film Board, that did films on this, on sort of community-oriented media that brought this issue out, on publications that came out. I remember writing for the Tahi at that time on this. It wasn't until that kind of galvanizing happened and mobilizing happened that you actually saw the other side. But when you did see Indigenous women as women, again, it fell into the trap of a kind of bourgeois language, which is she was a mother, she was a sister, she was a daughter, which is all fine, except that she was first and foremost a human being. So where is the human rights framework coming into this? And I think that's really important that we always look at that. How, in fact, a story is being told, and in what way can we disrupt the way that story is told so that we can actually find points of opening and bring it in, that in fact, what was happening to Indigenous women is happening even in Mexico, is happening in other parts of the world where, again, a colonial logic prevails, which is if we can use these women, we can salvage them, right? How can we use them in the maquiladoras where, these women with nimble fingers can make up all this stuff, and on the other hand, become cheap labor, so they're expendable. So we can salvage them in that way. When we can't salvage them is when we sort of like dump them. So we have to always look at that. And I think this becomes part of the wider picture. So it's not enough, in fact, to sort of like say, okay, we're going to insert ourselves. It's more important to say, okay, let's look at this case. With the Indigenous missing and murdered women, the kind of posters that were put out were all sort of mugshots of these women. They weren't women until you saw, in fact, the artists coming out, portraying these women in all of their complexities, that you actually got a sense of the humanity that was being erased and destroyed in the process. So I think we need to look at this from across the band and say, all right, it's not just the media, but it's also what are the pressure points that we can put in. And I remember very clearly that in the Rena Work situation, it was a court watch that we did that actually sort of like was able to insert that perspective, because we were looking at what are the holes, what are the media holes? And this is where, Shari's work, when she says, well, okay, they have a tight timeline. If they have a tight timeline, who can be there at that time? The horrible part of all of this is that it puts an onus on us to do this work, which is a lot of times unpaid work, underpaid work, right? And we're supposed to be there just to make sure that our voice and our perspective gets in. And this is why it becomes imperative to have that representation within the media. We have to always remember that the media are not other than us. They are us as well. And part of the thing also has to be that with the tight timelines, with the fact that newsrooms are shrinking, you know, the number of reporters are shrinking, how do we then play with that? So one of the ways we can figure that out is, okay, if this resource is shrinking, we can actually look at how reporters then try and find stories. And it's through the social media networks. So this is where social media becomes really important. We feed the stories, we feed the framing. And so when you look at things like the campaign Being Raped and Never Reported, which was started by 2 reporters, you know, it generated a lot of attention, media attention to this. And I think that it propelled, in fact, the Globe's own investigation, which was huge, on how many women had actually been raped and never reported it, because they had the resources to go to all the police stations to file, in fact, access to information reports, which gave them the police data in which they could write the stories. So this is where you see, in fact, this kind of sort of like twinning of resources. But it's the women that were reporters that had experienced this firsthand that actually put that out. So here's another case where, you know, you see, in fact, how that works. Or, you know, Kimberly Cranshaw's group, Say Our Name, the campaign in the US, which heavily relies, in fact, on social media reporting to say her name and therefore humanize that woman. So I remember with the Indigenous women, the missing and murdered, one of my students at the time, you know, using these kinds of tactics, actually went onto the main street in Montreal, St. Catharines, and wrote out the name of each of the Indigenous women that had been reported as murdered or missing. We have to do tactics like that, because it's not just depending on mainstream media, it's figuring out how we can actually insert perspectives in there. And how do we make them rely on us as the storytellers? So I think this becomes a very important case. And being present at those sort of police press conferences is really important. I think for activist organizations, you've got to be there. You've got to do the outreach. You've got to, you know who the people are and basically work with that. So it's not to say that we will be in a situation where we will never be able to hear the horrible things or to actually be trashed, because this is one of the fears. Every time we go into the media, we are always at risk, particularly as women of color, Indigenous women, you know, sexualized minorities, always at risk of having our stories used against us, of having us being used against us. So I think this is where, you know, the kind of solidarity that we have and that we can bridge, that we can create across groups becomes really imperative, which is, you know, the say, for instance, Insight, which is a group in the US, which has Indigenous women, women of color, Palestinian women, all of these women working across the board, you know, together on countering this, becomes, these are examples. Just like, you know, working with academics, feminist bureaucrats, you know, what I call bureaucrats within government. If I were to think, for instance, how in fact did we even get to the point where Statistics Canada was counting these bodies? It had to do with those feminist bureaucrats inside. So I think this is where that kind of bridge building, working together, becomes really important. And we can't let go of that, because we are against a system and a structure that has been in place for hundreds of years. You know, patriarchy has been around for, you know, since time immemorial, if I were to say that. And how, in fact, have we as women always had to counter that? without falling into the patriarchal bargain, which is that, yeah, he will look after me if I don't say anything. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate you identifying, going back to our title, the need to not just be present, but to disrupt these narratives. And I know a lot of anti-violence workers are used to disrupting things. So that's something they'll be familiar with as well. I want to get to our question, just our last question in terms of a piece of advice that each of you would have for folks in the GBV sector, something they could walk away with from this webinar in terms of how to engage media. And then we'll move into the Q&A, and I see lots of questions are coming in, so that's very exciting. And perhaps I'll start with you, Shari, in terms of a piece of advice for folks in the sector.
Well, one of the things that actually Liz Inglis referenced this in the chat, and I had it in my notes anyway to emphasize just in terms of the reframing that we've talked about being so important, is to really deliberately, explicitly say to reporters, we need to focus not on the women's choices and behavior, but the men's choices and behavior. And that's so obvious and so simple, but the default is not that, as we've already been reminded. So privileging that in any conversation, I think is, and really just asking, why are we asking questions about, focusing attention on, sharing the details of the woman's behavior, her clothing, her choices to be out at night, all of those things. We need to focus on the men's choices to harass, to assault, and to abuse. And then I also want to just reinforce the power that the media, social and legacy, the capacity they have to deliver change. And there have been references to, yeah, it's work, it's labor, it's not paid, it's on top of what you're already doing. But for me, one of the profound demonstrations of really quick impact for change was when Sunny Mariner in Ottawa and Liz Sheehy, a lawyer at a law professor at the University of Ottawa, to my understanding, they were among the first people to start talking about the Philadelphia model for assessing how police stations and police forces were treating sexual assault complaints and assessing the seriousness. And within a year of Sunny Mariner mentioning it in front of a parliamentary committee, and Liz Sheehy writing an op-ed in the Globe and Mail or the Ottawa Citizen, I forget which, within a year, the Globe took that up and did their huge investigative series. And within a year of that, they followed up and did an assessment of all the police forces across the country that had changed their practice. And so that's systemic change. And you as advocates, armed with greater comfort and ability and willingness to talk and be proactive and be present, have the power to, especially when you're able to offer really concrete, explicit solutions. And I know there are lots of questions, so I won't belabor this, but we have lots of resources on our website, a resource that we're happy to share. And if there's one specific thing that I'll say in terms of how you engage with reporters doing interviews on top of what I've already mentioned, that is to really work to make your language as concrete as possible. So the minute we sway into 5-syllable academic words and conceptual framing that journalists don't relate to, or that they don't know how to easily translate to their audience, what we know is that if people do not already know and care about an issue, and you're not talking about it in terms that they can picture, they're not going to care. And that doesn't mean that you feed them and reinforce the details about the assault or the crime that re-victimize the victim, but that you provide the alternative narrative, the solutions in really accessible, concrete language that they don't have to interpret, that they can just quote verbatim. And we have lots of examples and resources to support you all in doing that.
That's great. Thank you. And we will share those resources. I know everyone will be excited to go through them. Jennifer, I'd love to hear from you a piece of advice.
I had a little list that I I think I've used over the years. But Yasmin and Shari has just talked about some of them. I think important is absolutely like knowing your audience. Targeting your audience and understanding kind of what is going to capture them is important. Knowing kind of where to hit people. I often, again, even though, you know, in trafficking can start very young and happen very late for people in life. I often will lead with this is happening to, you know, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds. Why? Because I know most people care about children right off the hop, right? In society, most cultures care about caring for children, all cultures. And so that's my kind of first hook. So you know, knowing your audience, knowing what's going to kind of hook them is, I think, important. Having really clear and objective, you know, key messages. Also, again, you know, most people are not going to understand, as Shari just mentioned, very complex framework. And then if that's how you're speaking to reporters, I find, again, you're going to be doing a lot of correcting, which might not be helpful because, as we've already talked about, a lot of this work is going to be trying to do it off the side of your desk, you know, and not necessarily paid. For Indigenous organizations. They're definitely way underfunded. And so, you know, for Indigenous women's org, they are definitely going to be probably trying to do this work off the side of their desk. So having kind of an ability to take a little bit of a step back and really recognize the good benefit that can come out of this for the folks that they're working with and doing a bit of this work is, I think, helpful. Having a call for action is important too, and trying to leverage days that are already, you know, widely kind of known for groups of folks or months, awareness months, those types of things are, again, helpful. You'll get more pickup that way, and you're just leveraging an already, you know, people are already looking at the topic, so it's just kind of leveraging that momentum, which is helpful. I think also really just, you know, being able to know the questions. I've, you know, again, having done a lot of media in my personal and professional life, have tried to get to know reporters. So I know which issues are important to them. And if we're going to reach out to do a story, then I know who is likely to pick it up and who is likely not to, depending on, you know, the issue that we're talking about. So that can be helpful, knowing who the reporters are in your community and what issues are really important to them and who will work with you to, you know, really kind of, again, push that message out for you, and to use kind of that reporter's ability to capture a larger audience for that message, I think, is really key. Also, some of the campaigns that a lot of, like, again, grassroots community groups have started become, like, you know, Yasmin and Shari posted these massive campaigns that grow and grow and grow, really started with a few women for the most part, right? Talking about, hey, this is happening and nobody's talking about it, and why the heck is it not being talked about? And so the more people do that, then the more people, again, now with social media, start to go, well, hey, I know somebody that happened to, or I know that happened to me. And again, you know, you get more people reading the message and learning more. So I think, again, that's really key. I find, though, that, again, we often, and even I'm definitely guilty of this, we're often, you know, kind of targeting other groups of women to kind of help us take, you know, charge or amplify or leverage our voice. Whereas we need to, I think, in some aspect, in some ways, start focusing on who are the abusers. And so I know, you know, Shari, you talked about that with Picton, like looking at, you know, pieces of that in Yasmin and your research. Also, you know, who are the people that are abusing and why do we not talk about them? And if we do, it always seems to be in this downplayed role. Versus, again, no, these people are really harming, you know, people in our community, and that's not just okay. So trying to focus some of the message on that as well, I think, is really important, and can, again, kind of help push your message out. Being a bit flexible, but also, again, I'm just kind of repeating now, you know, knowing how and kind of the cycle of news is also important. And again, if you're a very small organization, you don't have
that capacity, then, trying to link in with larger associations or again, national organizations, women's organizations that are, able to do some of that can be helpful. ONWA is an association, so we work with all our chapters and councils on doing some of that work with them, for them, helping to push that message out again. And like I said, reach out to other organizations that, are not necessarily a member of the, Ontario Native Women's Association, but we know they're Indigenous women's organizations across Canada. And so we want to do whatever we can do to help them get that message out about what they're dealing with in their community. And lastly, I would say really just, act with integrity and honor the folks that you're working with. Because you do that on a lot of your frontline work. And sometimes in media, I don't want to vilify reporters, because I worked with a lot of good reporters in my career, but sometimes they can try to get you to, do that sensationalizing, because, that's, again, it's unfortunately what sells. But make sure you, again, kind of take a step back and think about, why are you doing this? Who are you honoring? Who are you representing? Or who are you trying to honor and represent? And do that with integrity. And I think, you'll be well positioned. Even asking for questions before you just go into an interview can be really helpful. It can give folks a bit of time to just gather their thoughts, think about, again, what's the objective of this? What do I want to gain out of this? This isn't just about, you being interviewed, or you're not doing it really for that reason, right? You're doing it for a larger purpose, a larger objective. So really it gives you a bit of time to also utilize that interview for your purpose.
Thank you so much for giving access to your list, Jennifer. I know that's so intensely helpful. And I wanted to make space, Yasmin, if you have any final pieces of advice for anti-violence workers before we move into the Q&A portion.
I think much of what I would have said is already been said. So what I'd like to end up with is just making sure that one has resources like fact sheets and statistics on hand, so that one can always sort of like take individual cases and put them into that kind of context. I think that's really important. And oftentimes reporters don't have that, or don't have the time to go and do that kind of research. So having those fact sheets, and many organizations already have those fact sheets, just having them on hand, I think is really important. I mean, just to say that, for instance, every week more than 2 women are being murdered across Canada says something. It makes it more tangible, right? So numbers do have that kind of magic, that kind of power. And the second thing is that drawing parallels. So, if we were to learn how to do that, I think would be really interesting. And it would also give the reporter some other kind of hook to hang a story on. Parallels between, okay, so if the perpetrator is being psychologized in a way where it's all about mental health issues, if you were to draw another parallel and say, okay, well, what about this? What about this case? So it brings it up, and it actually shows up in a very stark way that what's happening here is a kind of sort of like a bias. It's a racist or sexist undertone that is being used to support the meaning of a given story. So I think those are the 2 things that I would do. And the third thing that I would do, having worked in an organization which had very little money, and wanting to bring attention to something, was to create an event. So I've looked at how, in fact, student groups have done this in terms of like what happened at Concordia, in terms of the creating sort of like passes or like gates, so that to bring up the notion of what Palestinians go through every time they have to go through a security check, or what the Vancouver Status of Women used to do when it was vibrant and fully funded, send shoes in to the budget minister on the eve of the budget being released. All these old shoes would be sent there because it's free postage. And because the tradition is that the Minister of Finance will always buy a pair of new shoes on the day that the budget is going to be released. So knowing these things and stepping in that way, or for instance, what the immigration, or what one group did, which was a refugee advocacy group, was to have body bags placed all along the stairs to the parliament. And that was a way to show how many people were dying. So, you know, some of this work is already being done in terms of Indigenous women, in terms of the red dress, the artwork, the quilting, and so forth. But how do we push it? How do we make an event out of it? Because when you make an event, you can then call the media to it. You can organize the press conference. This is where it becomes one way in which we insert our stories. So it's the storytelling is one very powerful vehicle, and it's our story to tell. So how do we tell the story?
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for those examples as well. I'm now joined by my colleague, Sabria Del Sadi, and we are going to present questions that the audience has been submitting as you've been going through our panel discussion. And Sabria, I might let you start. I was so engrossed in the conversation, I wasn't keeping track. So if you would like to ask the first question, that'd be wonderful.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you so much for this rich and very informative panel. We got many questions, but I want to start with questions to for the three of you. So the question will be, can you each speak to the harassment that violence against women advocates receive when they speak out in the media and social media?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that happens right away is that you're labeled as a victim of violence. So you have sort of like what's the word for it? A grind, an axe to grind, basically. And so you're put in that position. This is really interesting because it can become an opening, you know, and in one way, for me, what I do is I continually point to colonialism as the biggest form of violence, as a technology of violence. And so how has it put us in those kinds of different places? The other thing is, of course, the responses, the negative responses, the really poisonous stuff that comes at you from all kinds of angles is really awful. Like, I've had people who've written to me from all the way on the other side of Canada to tell me to go back to where I come from. So, you know, you always get that kind of thing, or you're not deserving. And I think this is where, when we think about strategies, we need to think about what are the kinds of credibilities or the sort of like resources of credibility that we can utilize in order to make our stories heard and be considered credible. For me, the route has been through the academy. So the academy has given me that kind of anchor where I can say, well, what I'm saying is not just an opinion, but it is an informed opinion. It's based on research. So you know, that kind of sort of twinning becomes really important as a way to counter the kinds of thing. And finally, I would say, and this is something that I have said, even in terms of the work that I've done with an organization like Conversation Canada, which, by the way, if you're a frontline worker or you're working in a small organization, team up with an academic in an institution close to you, because this becomes one way in which you can insert a voice. The Conversation Canada publishes short stories, and they have editors that help with making those stories, sort of like those accounts, accessible, but they're grounded in research. And when there is a twinning of an academic and an advocate writing for this, what often happens, especially now, given that so many newsrooms have been shrinking and have a shrinking budget, is they're constantly looking for op-eds to insert. So I've had op-eds inserted in newspapers that I would otherwise never have had access to. And these op-eds become really powerful. I mean, there was an example, I couldn't believe it, where there was a woman who was going to be deported. And I got approached by some of the advocates who had been basically standing outside the deportation center for hours on end and weren't getting any responses. I wrote a piece with this advocate. It went into the Conversation Canada. then the very next day, I got an email immediately from one of the immigration officers in that chain of command, which nobody had responded to these groups. So how do we leverage, these resources around credibility? How do we actually join with them to make something? Because we alone, I don't think it's impossible. It's impossible to undertake structural change alone. So this becomes one way. And finally, I would say that one of the things that I've been advocating for really strongly is a cutoff on the comments, the open comments that are there when news reporters write or when they're online, both online and offline. Because those comments are one way in which we actually feed into a populist opinion base. And we don't want to do that. And the second thing is that those comments become, in fact, they become layered, they accumulate, there's an accretion over time, and they kind of gather force in a way. And so you don't want that to happen. So we know, in fact, that a lot of the coverage on immigration, on Indigenous issues, will generate those kinds of comments. So those stories cannot be open to commenting from other people. So this is my perspective.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yasmin. Shari, Jennifer, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would say that just to the point you just made, to know that the comments are not remotely representative of the broad population's perspective. And so I agree they should be, and often are, increasingly cut off. And in terms of as advocates and activists, when you are suddenly made the focus of the story and people are saying, well, were you affected? You have an axe to grind in Yasmin's analogy. I would do what has been recommended already. I think Jennifer suggested this and Yasmin too, about defaulting to data and learning to bridge. We have some concrete examples in the handout, going immediately from the question to, this is an issue that affects millions of women every day. Why would you make it personal about me? And throw the question back to the journalist to challenge their framing, because it's a default that's automatic. They're not thinking about it. Why would you make it personal about me? And then continuing with the advocacy. So you're not answering the question, you're simply reminding the journalist that the question, the framing is inappropriate. And then ditto to all sorts of what Yasmin has already said. I'll defer to you, Jennifer.
I think a lot of it has already been said. I would, I guess, point out, and again, I don't think I'm pointing it out, but mention it, that a lot of folks working in different sectors in gender-based violence are personally impacted by that, whether they're, public about that or not. And I think for, Indigenous women's organizations, you can't walk into a room without somebody in the room having someone who they love being missing or murdered. And so it's deeply personal. And then when you have, like, Yasmin, the comments, I tend not to read them personally. I don't even read them after I do media, just because, again, I know there's gonna be trolls that, are going to attempt to harass me personally about whatever I've spoken about. And I think, we have a team at ONWA that, again, tries to remove those negative comments, and largely not because we're trying to silence people, largely because we don't want folks who have already suffered a great deal of trauma, largely because of systems, to continually have to suffer that in reading about, their loved one missing or being murdered or being sexually violated, or any of the other number of gender-based violence areas that Indigenous women face in our country every day. So I think, again, if you are doing that, taking care of yourself is really important. If you're doing those media articles, especially for the frontline folks that might, be impacted by that already daily by the folks that they're working with through vicarious trauma. My social worker self comes out, or I say, like, you need to take care of yourself, and you need to be okay with having some, like, Shari said, knowing that there will be people, and Yasmin, there are going to be people that reach out to you to talk trash, my mom would say. And just gotta, I think, learn to sometimes just know that is what it is and not take it personally. It isn't about you. It's about their own ignorance, and so just being conscious of that, I think, can help.
Thank you. I think we only have time for one more question and probably short responses, if that's okay. But I wanted to get to this one in terms of recognizing both media, but also other systems that interact with media. And so this person was wondering what role, if any, does/can the government play in shaping/reshaping media narratives?
Oh, boy.
Yeah, I know it's a large question to end off on.
The government is attempting to intervene in the social media environment with a bill that has been many years in the making, that is very controversial, that is attempting to disrupt and challenge social media. And the result at the moment of that effort to intervene by government is that the social media giants are threatening to no longer share news stories from Canadian sources, which has huge implications, certainly for informed opinions, given the work we do, for independent journalists. So yeah, I would say, as somebody who's looked at this issue for many years, there's no obvious, clear means of the government intervening in the issues that we've talked about that will be effective and accepted. And the one caveat that I would or alternative that I would share about that is the need for them to hold social media giants accountable in terms of the abuse on social media. And other countries in Europe have actually intervened in ways that have helped, and Canada should be following what's happened in Europe and the UK on that front. But in terms of news reporting, I think that's a real challenge.
Yasmin, I couldn't tell if you're reaching for the mouse to unmute.
Well, I just wanted to say, I mean, since the question was about the Canadian government and its relationship to this issue, or it's what it does or doesn't do in terms of the framing of this issue, I think one of the big things is that within the UN, there are groups that have been working on this very, I would say, very intensely. And the Rutgers group actually has come out with a whole sort of compendium on how violence against women should be reported. The problem with the Canadian government is that, things like wars and the buying of arms and the selling of arms take up so much space that the impact of those arms on the people that are going to be dying, that never gets the kind of attention that it should, right? So I think this is where, within government, and since governments, as Shari pointed out, so much of what we hear is the reporting of public officials within government. So we're getting the government side of the story. What we're not getting is the other side of the story. And yet there are departments within government that would clearly offer another alternative if they can speak, which oftentimes they can't speak. So this is where I think, community pressure has to come in to actually shift the focus so that we're not talking about, just the arms that we're selling to other parts of the world, but in fact, who's dying as a result of these arms? So what are we responsible for in that global picture, right? How, in fact, for instance, somebody once said, do you know that the bullets that were being made for the Iraq war were actually being manufactured in Quebec? Well, what does this say about us being a so-called, peacekeeping nation. When in fact we're so involved in the wars and the destabilizing that's going on around the world. And that's leading, in fact, to mass evacuations, mass movements of people. And in the process, we're not even talking about the violence that occurs to women who are fleeing war zones, that is perpetrated by our soldiers, right? That puts them in places of vulnerability to be sex trade, to be traded and trafficked. All of these things are not coming out. So I think we need to, this is where I think the only way we can do this is the pressure from the outside.
Thank you so much. We are out of time. There are so many questions we didn't get to, but this is something that we'll continue looking at. I do want to thank our panelists, Jennifer, Yasmin, and Shari, for all the rich knowledge that you brought today, as well to our ASL interpreters, Joanne and Emma, and our French language interpreters, Sylvie and Caroline. For all the participants, I want to remind you that there will be an evaluation form, should open right in your browser after the Zoom session ends. And that's where you can share some feedback as well as gain your certificate of participation. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.